Okay, so in this video tutorial, basically I am going to talk about the enzyme inhibition mechanism. Actually, there are so many enzyme inhibition mechanisms like competitive enzyme inhibition, non-competitive enzyme inhibition, like uncompetitive enzyme inhibition, like mixed inhibition. So I will try to cover both this inhibition mechanism in this video tutorial. So at first I want to talk about the competitive inhibition. The competitive inhibition. Let's suppose this is the enzyme and this is the active site of this enzyme, and let's suppose this is the substrate, and let's assume that this is our inhibitor. Now if you look at the structural configuration of this active site and the structural configuration of this substrate and the inhibitor, both are similar. In this case, if the concentration of this substrate is higher than the concentration of this inhibitor, then the substrate will go and bind with this active site of this enzyme, and it will form the enzyme substrate complex, and from this enzyme substrate complex we will easily get our product. But if the concentration of inhibitor is higher than the concentration of substrate, at the time the inhibitor will go and bind with this enzyme before the substrate. As soon as the inhibitor will bind with this enzyme, it will form the enzyme inhibitor complex, and from this enzyme inhibitor complex we will not able to get our product, because the enzyme will not able to convert this inhibitor into specific product. The enzyme will only able to convert the substrate into specific product. So what will be the reaction? Let's suppose the enzyme will bind with the substrate. Now it will form the enzyme substrate complex, and from this enzyme substrate complex, due to the enzymatic reaction, the substrate will convert into a specific product. This is whatever the first step of reaction. Now, in case if the concentration of this inhibitor is higher than the concentration of the substrate, at that time the enzyme will bind with the inhibitor before the substrate, and it will form the enzyme inhibitor complex. But from this enzyme inhibitor complex, the enzyme will not able to convert this inhibitor into specific product, or actually the enzyme inhibitor complex will stop to formation of product, and it will stop the formation of enzyme substrate complex, so that we will not able to get our product. It will stop formation of product. This is whatever the sense of competitive inhibition. Now I want to talk about the non-competitive inhibition. This is quite complex than the competitive inhibition. Non-competitive inhibition. In this case, let's suppose this is an enzyme, and this site is known as the allosteric binding site, or the regulatory site, or the inhibitor binding site, or the modulator binding site. But in this case, I consider that this site is known as the inhibitor binding site, and this site is known as the active site, as the substrate will come and bind with this site. And let's suppose this is the substrate of this enzyme, and this is the inhibitor, this is the substrate, and this is the inhibitor of this enzyme. In case of non-competitive inhibition, actually there is not any kind of competition between the inhibitor and the substrate like the competitive inhibition. In this case, because they have their own binding site, substrate will bind with the active site or the substrate binding site, and the inhibitor will bind with the inhibitor binding site or the regulator site or the modulator site. Now, if the concentration of substrate is higher than the concentration of inhibitor, then the substrate will bind before the inhibitor with this enzyme to its active site or the substrate binding site. If the concentration of inhibitor is higher than the substrate, the inhibitor will bind before the substrate into the inhibitor binding site. But if the concentration of substrate and the inhibitor is similar, at that time it will depend on their affinity to their enzyme or to their binding site. If the affinity of this inhibitor is higher than the substrate to this enzyme, then the inhibitor will bind with this enzyme before the substrate. But if the affinity of the substrate is higher than the inhibitor, then the substrate will go and bind with the active site of this enzyme. So it's depend on the affinity and the concentration. Let's suppose the enzyme will first bind with this substrate, then it will form the enzyme substrate complex. As soon as it will form the enzyme substrate complex, the inhibitor will come and bind with this inhibitor binding site. Now what will happen? If the inhibitor will come and bind with this enzyme substrate complex, they will form the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. The enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. In some case, if the inhibitor will bind with this enzyme before the substrate, let's suppose the inhibitor will bind before the substrate, now they will form the enzyme inhibitor complex. As soon as the enzyme will form the enzyme inhibitor complex, the substrate will come and bind with this enzyme inhibitor complex, and they will form the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. In some case, if the inhibitor will take long time to bind with this inhibitor binding site, at that time the enzyme will convert the substrate into specific product. But as soon as the inhibitor will bind with this enzyme substrate complex, or as soon as the inhibitor will bind with this enzyme, and as soon as it will produce the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, it will stop the production of product. This is what about the sense of non-competitive inhibition. There is not any kind of competition between the inhibitor and the substrate. Whatever may be their concentration, whatever may be their affinity, both of them will bind with their particular binding site. That's why there is not any kind of competition between the inhibitor and between the substrate. This is what about the sense of non-competitive inhibition. Now I have to talk about the uncompetitive inhibition. In case of uncompetitive inhibition, let's suppose this is an enzyme and this is the active site of this enzyme, and this is the inhibitor binding site. Let's suppose this is the product of this enzyme. This is the substrate of this enzyme. This is the substrate, and let's suppose this is the inhibitor. If you look at the structural composition or the structural configuration of the active site and the substrate is quite similar. But if you see the structural configuration of the regulatory site, of the regulatory binding site, of the inhibitor binding site, and the inhibitor is not quite similar. Now in this case, the enzyme will bind to the substrate. At first, the enzyme will bind with the substrate. In case of uncompetitive inhibition, always enzyme will bind with the substrate. In first step, the enzyme will bind with the substrate and it will form the enzyme substrate complex. As soon as the substrate will bind with this active site, the structural configuration of this inhibitor binding site will change, and it will be like that, so that the inhibitor will come and bind with this inhibitor binding site. This is what about the sense. When the substrate will bind with this active site or the substrate binding site of this enzyme, and when it will form the enzyme substrate complex, at that time the structural configuration of this inhibitor binding site will change, so that the inhibitor will come and bind with this inhibitor binding site of this enzyme. Now, as soon as they will form the enzyme substrate complex, and as soon as the structural configuration of this inhibitor binding site will change, the inhibitor will come and bind with this inhibitor binding site, and again they will form the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. But in some case, if the inhibitor will take long time to bind with this inhibitor binding site, and if the structural configuration of this inhibitor binding site will take long time to change itself, at the time the enzyme will convert this substrate into specific product. But as soon as the structural configuration of this inhibitor binding site will change, and the inhibitor will come and bind with this inhibitor binding site. And as soon as they will form the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, they will stop production of this product. This is what about the sense of competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, and this is what about the sense of uncompetitive inhibition. Now the last one, this is the mixed inhibition. This is not very much tough. In case of mixed inhibition, actually this type of inhibition is depend on the affinity of the substrate and the inhibitor. If the substrate affinity is higher than the affinity of the inhibitor, then the substrate will come and bind with the active site of an enzyme. Now, if the affinity of the inhibitor is higher than the affinity of the substrate, at that time the inhibitor will go and bind with the inhibitor binding site, or maybe it will bind with the active site, like the competitive inhibition. Now, and the mixed inhibition is fully depend on the affinity of the substrate and the affinity of the inhibitor. So this is what about today's video lecture. I hope all the data provided by me will surely help for your study. So thank you very much for watching my video.